We have talked sort of informally about the idea of scope, which is where a variable name is accessible. And I want to go over a few things to make sure it's a little more clear in your minds how that's going to work. So the goal of this part is to see when you can use a variable name in code. So the main thing to remember is that variable names only exist in a certain scope. You can use a variable name once it's been declared, and that variable name goes away when it leaves the curly braces or the code block or the scope in which they're declared in. So down here, for example, we have a method scope test, and we declare a variable here and initialize it. We can use it, but once we leave the curly braces that it's defined in, you can no longer use it. All right, so that part's pretty simple, but it has a lot of ramifications when you look at code, how things happen. So in the last video, we talked a little bit about qualified names as a way to access methods in a class, and that basically says how you get to something that exists somewhere else. That's different from a variable, right? Those are method names. They're not variables. So they may seem related, but it's not really the same thing at all. The scope determines how names are resolved to values. So one thing about this is that you can use a variable in multiple locations in code, and when you see that name, which one is it using? Well, it's using the one in that scope. Okay, so one thing is that we can have multiple scopes in a piece of code. So I'm going to make a little tiny if statement, and this code block here is its own scope. And so I can declare it in here, and I can use it, and that's all fine, right? But if I try to use J outside of that scope, it says it's undeclared, or it can't resolve it to a variable. So it doesn't know about J outside of this scope, and really from this point on. And again, that's something that I think hopefully you're starting to see a little bit. One thing, of course, that means is that down up here, I can declare J, and this J is distinct from this J. So again, the scope is helping us organize our code a little bit, even though I use the same name, and sometimes that's useful, like using index or count or something like that. These are distinct things. They are stored in different parts in the computer memory, and they're only usable in their own scope. In other words, when the code is executing through those lines is when you can see it. So again, this is allowed because those are two different J's there. But I am not allowed to have duplicate declarations in the same scope. So there was a J already existing, and then down here I try to redeclare it, and you're not allowed to do that. Again, I can reassign it, I can give it a new value, and that's perfectly fine. I can use it, but I can't say make me another variable called J, because it already exists in this scope. Parameters act like variables in that local scope of the method. So for example, int x is accessible anywhere in the scope of that method. And again, it's distinct from some other x elsewhere. But because that has scope in the method, if I have j here, I can't redeclare it here, right? Because that's the duplicate declaration. So be careful thinking that somehow that's not related to the code in here. If I have a variable here, I, this is its scope is from where it's declared, I, down to the end of the scope of this method block that it's defined in. I can also, let me get rid of this line here. I can, for example, access I in this inner scope. So this is called a nested scope. Here's one scope here, and inside it is another, oops, don't want to move it. Inside it is another scope. So this J lives inside the scope in which it's defined. This I lives in the scope in which it's defined, and I can use it anywhere in there, including scopes that are nested inside it. In other words, when I ask for I here, it says, does I exist in the current scope? It says no, and it says, am I surrounded by another scope? And yes, you are, so you can use the I that's used there. And I can't put a, that's a Python kind of syntax there. I can, this is going to add those two numbers together, but I can use it, okay? All right, so you can have multiple layers of scopes, and in fact, you can make a scope without any if statement, and this is all legal. It gets the J from this scope that contains it, and it gets the I from the scope that contains that scope here. And it doesn't go away when it hits the end of this scope. Only things that were declared in that scope go away. So I doesn't go away until it hits the end of the scope in which it's declared, this big one here. So let's see, we're getting a little, let's just get rid of that, a little complicated to see. So here's a scope with a J in it. I'm going to make another scope. If I try to say J here, it doesn't know about it, because J is only valid in the scope in which it's declared, and it goes away at the end of that code block. So this doesn't have any meaning. Because of that, I am allowed to declare a new J here. And again, this is a different J than this J, different places in the computer memory. And so again, these are sequential scopes, and they don't conflict with each other. In some sense, that's what's going on with methods. That's why I can have a count here, and if I make another method, I can have a parameter count here. Those are the same names, but this one has scope inside this method, and this count has scope inside this method. And again, those are two distinct entities, right? Just because they have the same name doesn't mean that they are the same thing. And so those are sequential scopes in the sense that they are not nested inside each other, and they're not in the same scope, but they are in two different scopes, and so the same variable name is okay there. Okay, so there's a bunch of different little rules, but for the most part, the only one you have to remember is a variable exists from when it's declared until the end of the scope that it's declared in. And that, if you follow that rule, you're in good shape.